slides. So Julia, if you would do that. And I want to welcome everyone to our Multisite Movement Continues to Grow webinar. My name's Josh Whitehead. I'm joined today by Greg Ligon and Chris Mavity. We're so excited that we get to share with you guys some of the amazing things that are continuing to happen in the Multisite movement. And I'll remind you again, but just as we get started, there's a chat area where you can go in and let us know about yourself, your church, how many campuses that your church has, just a little bit about what's going on in your area. But then also there's a Q&A area as well. If you have a question as we go through the slides, we've intentionally created some time for dialogue with our host as well. So I want to start off by introducing you guys to Greg Ligon. Greg actually serves with Leadership Network and does an incredible job overseeing strategic initiatives now, just really transitioned into that role, Greg. But Greg really has been involved in the Multisite movement for years upon years. He's a published author and continues to be so influential in all that God's doing in the Multisite movement and through our work at Leadership Network. I just say thanks, Greg, for having such a heart and a passion for this and really seeing this work through as well. And so I just want to welcome you. Greg, tell us a little bit more about yourself and then keep us moving forward.
You bet. Thanks, Josh. It's a thrill to be here today. And I have been involved with what's been going on in the multi-site space for a number of years, about 15 probably. And so it's been a real privilege to be able to have kind of a front row seat to see the work that God's doing through the movement. We've had our first gathering of churches. Actually, about 15 years ago, 17 years ago now, 18 years ago, I guess now, on 9/11 yesterday would have been. So we had about 65 churches gathered, and the movement just continues to grow. We're still, over 8,000 churches that have campuses. And so some really great things continue to happen. We're excited to have the opportunity to share some of those things with you today. My partner in crime is Chris Mavity. And I know Chris most of those years as well. He was at North Coast Church when we got this thing started, and they were part of our very first group of churches that we put together. And Chris has also had a lot of input into what's been going on in terms of multi-site churches. He's now on the team at Generis and helping with some of their multi-site ministry that they're doing and working with churches in that space as well. And Chris, welcome. And it's been a privilege to work with you as we've worked together on this research.
Yeah, ditto, Greg. Thank you so much. When you said 15 years, I was like, oh, I'm not as old as I thought I was, because I can remember conversations that go back further than that. And of course, some of the events that we were involved in this early pioneer days, really, of the multi-site movement. And so for not only you, but the entire network team, I don't think we'd be at where we're at. Well, I know for a fact we wouldn't be at where we are today if it weren't for the catalytic leadership you and Dave Travis and others at the network have put into this thing. And you guys are great fans. You just find the flame and fan it, and throw gas on it and do everything else. So thanks for the work you've done over the years and the books you've written and your own work in my life. I'm deeply indebted to you. So thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks, Chris. And I want to turn it back over to Josh Whitehead. Josh Whitehead is executive pastor at Faith Promise Church in Knoxville. And I kind of lose track how many church campuses you have. I think it's 8. Am I right, Josh?
That's correct.
Okay, 8 campuses. He also directs a lot of our work that we're doing currently with multi-site churches here at Leadership Network. And so he's been a great friend and partner for a number of years now. And I want to turn it back over to Josh, and we'll get started.
Well, we're so grateful that you guys joined us today. And I want to just remind you again of a couple of the features available during the webinar. One, there's a chat box where you can just continue to put where you're joining us from today, the number of campuses that you have. And then also there's a Q&A area where you can go in if you have a question. We've strategically placed some time during this webinar to answer questions as they may come in that you may have. Also, you'll receive an email at the end of the webinar that will give you access to the full report that's been created around this content, and as well as a link to the webinar as well. So you'll receive all the information. So don't feel like you have to take copious notes. It's going to be a great chance for you just to enjoy the dialogue that happens today. So we're glad you guys are with us. And I want to start out with Chris Mavity, and we're just going to walk through the key findings that came about in the multi-site movement continues to grow. So Chris, go ahead and kick us off.
Well, yeah, you can see the slide there. And to me, this slide just represents and kind of underlines the stability of this movement. And clearly the trial period, that time frame is over. There's enough proofs in rural settings, urban settings, big church, small church, different ilks of Christianity and so on, of the workability of multi-site. And to me, it's just a really stable time frame. And it's no wonder that churches are not only continuing in their endeavor, but you can see there that 76% are going to continue in the same structure. So multi-site is here to stay and has had a great influence on the church in America today. So it's going to be around for a while, and the churches that are participating are having huge success.
Chris, I think this is one of the most important findings, at least was for me. I know that we've heard a lot in the media, as it says there in that first bullet, about, is the end coming for multi-site? And there obviously we're continuing to track that. We believe that multi-site is a strategy, and God's used it for this season, and whenever He's done using it, we'll figure out what the next thing is. But some of the things that you're hearing in the media say, it's really coming to a close, or certainly slowing down. As I look at some of the churches that have made decisions to release their campuses into church plants, in most cases, that has little to do with the multi-site strategy, has more to do with the leadership style or an overall strategy related to their church. And several cases has to do with a strong passion for church planting as well. So anyway, I thought this was very important finding, that we continue to see 76% of the churches that were surveyed intend to remain multi-site under one governance structure. And kind of closely, the second slide that you see here on the screen now says that multi-site churches have continued their growth in weekly worship attendance. So 96% of the churches in the survey reported that their church worship was growing or stable in total attendance, and 82% indicated that their church was growing. Of that number, 24% indicated their attendance was growing significantly by more than 10%. I think one of the major things to note here is that as churches continue in their growth, trajectory, then also they're really focusing on this effective ministry, and then that's what's allowing multi-site to expand. We've said from the very beginning that multi-site is not a good strategy to instigate growth, but it's certainly a great strategy to help growth be able to continue in a congregation.
Yeah, Greg, I think that that's important to note. And then, of course, that leads into this next slide, that the momentum for becoming multi-site is growing and very strong. Many of us are familiar with this adoption curve kind of concept, and that is what happens when entrepreneurs and kind of those early innovators have done their work. And of course, that's what gets the news media, but there's a big, huge percentage of churches that follow that and are going to become multi-site. In fact, I think that more churches will become multi-site in the next 20 years than that became multi-site in the last 20 years. So the two key components to that, at least to me, are number one, sort of a leadership quotient. And we can see on the next couple slides that the average number of campuses is 4.71, but the family tree is expanding. And so what that takes is for a multi-site church to go from, let's say, 3 to 8 or 10 or 12 is leadership and the ability to simplify complexity. I love the family tree analogy, and any of us with more than one child knows that when you have child number 2, 3, or 4, or whatever it might be, the complexity isn't just added, it becomes exponential. And the same is true with our multi-site churches. And so, Greg, I know that you and Josh, myself, have all worked with churches that as they've simplified, they've been able to expand. And the reason why is complexity stifles our ability to expand. And so when we get simplified and we keep things simple, it's much easier to expand. And probably number 5 is the biggest encouragement, and that is that churches or sites or campuses are now spawning off grandchild campuses. And it doesn't take a mathematician to know that when that starts happening, things begin to exponentially multiply. And so that's one of the reasons that it's kind of easy to look at the past and then look to the future and go, man, there's going to be a lot more multi-site churches along the way.
That's good. Another thing in terms of, if we were to go back to this last slide here where you see the innovation curve, of course, we're still seeing that because of the growth in the movement, that we still feel like overall it's in this kind of early stages on the left-hand side of the curve. But the other thing that's very unique, and we'll be sharing some of those stories along the way, is we're beginning to see a new wave of innovation that's happening with some of the early pioneering churches. So some of the things that North Coast is doing and Life Church is doing and Seacoast and Community Christian, some of those that were part of the very first early movement are now innovating again. And so we're seeing some really unique things that happen there. And as Chris said, we're very encouraged by the fact that we're beginning to see churches that have campuses that are birthing campuses because that is where the exponential growth is beginning to take place. I think we're going to move to a little bit of Q&A now. And Josh, you want to...
Yeah, guys, a couple of questions for each of you. The first one is for churches that are growing right now that aren't using multi-site as that strategy, can you say what they're doing that's creating growth? What are they adopting? What strategies? Any thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts. Greg, you want to go first?
Go for it. Go for it.
Well, one of the things that we see is that the churches that are really having that, let's say, greater than 10% annual growth is the ability to understand well the culture that they find themselves in. Now, not the culture expanded our whole entire country, but the niche culture that they're involved with. And here's the, I don't know if it's the master key, but if it's not, it's right next to the master key. Adding value to that segment of the culture. And there's lots of different ways to do it. That's sometimes why we can't just take a program that works really well in the Southeast and try to transfer it to the Midwest or the West Coast, or, Seattle or whatever. It's really understanding that culture and the nuances of the culture well enough to really deliver very high value to those folks that are within that culture.
Mm-hmm. I would kind of echo that. I think that's exactly right. And, one of the things that we're doing in some of our other work at Leadership Network involves the use of data and really being able to use data as a piece of information that helps us to better understand, better know our church, those who are a part of our congregation already, but then also to know our communities as well. And so as you know people better, that value, the ability to add value to them, both inside and outside the church, is a win because you're being able to attract people and go to people where they are and add that value. For the growth side of it is people coming in, but then also internally, as you get to know people better, the retention. It's really helping churches to begin to close the back door some as they have a better understanding of who their people are and how they can best serve them and minister to them.
So, hey guys, and one last one in this section, I think that most resonates with our viewers, is that you guys spoke about there's this complexity that happens in multi-site. And I know we could go on actually the rest of our time just in the thought of how do you create simplicity as you launch campuses. But why don't you guys just maybe one of you weigh in on how do you create this simplicity?
Well, to me, it's all a matter of clarity. You can't simplify unless you're clear. And you have to be clear about the priorities first of all, direction, first of all, and then priorities. And when you get clarity around direction and priorities, then some of the political / complexity / time wasting things just filter into the background. And so we have to be crystal clear on our direction and then our priorities. And then clarity isn't something you create, it's something that you observe. And so if you can get rid of all of the noise and that begins to go away, then it's like, oh, I know exactly what to do next, why it's important, and then how to get it done.
Perfect. Well, why don't we keep moving forward, Greg, and if you'll lead us from this point and keep us going through our insights that we're going to gain today.
Sure, you bet. One of the things that has always been of interest to us, and that we have asked on a number of occasions, is how about churches that close? And so we asked that question again. In the past, we've gotten very, very few responses. We got a few more responses here, but not really still enough to provide any kind of statistically significant conclusions. But as you review the responses, the kinds of things that are reasons for that are pretty consistent. The top two were lack of attendance and wrong campus pastors. The third was not financially viable. And my perspective is that probably this wrong campus pastor is probably the number one, and it's probably the driver for lack of attendance and not being financially viable. Only 3 churches that are out of the close to 500 reported that the reason that they closed a campus was as a result of a change in their multi-site vision. Another thing that we haven't asked before that we did this time was, when you closed a campus, what was the impact, financial impact of that as a result of the decision to close? And 48% of those churches surveyed indicated that they lost under $100,000. The second greatest response at 27% was a larger loss of between $100,000 and $250,000, primarily driven by facilities kind of related things and staffing related kinds of things. So we continue to see very few closures.
Yeah, which is great news, and talks about not only the stability, but information is available for help and what to do next in the multi-site movement. This slide is probably the most interesting to me because I wasn't expecting this to the question, and that you can see that overall the staff and the board reporting about how they felt about their multi-site movement and challenges and so on and so forth was that the board was overwhelmingly more positive than the staff. I'm not sure why that is, but I think it brings up 2 points as you're considering any kind of a move into multi-site or any kind of expansion, and that is that communication is absolutely vital. Communication at all levels within your organization. And then also the second part of it is the culture that you're creating positive towards the expansion, neutral towards the expansion, or negative? And to me, it almost boils down to this. Discipleship without an expansion mindset is kind of an oxymoron, because if you're creating disciples, that means that you're going to have more disciples, which means you're going to have to either grow the one thing bigger or have more things. And so very interesting. I'd love to ask more questions about this, but it shows that there's slightly a kilter. It's not horrible, but making sure that staff, board, and all other constituents understand the reason why. They might not need to agree with it, and they might not agree with it, but as long as they understand the why side of the multi-site, I think we're all in a better shape to move forward.
Good. Our next finding is around mergers, and I think early on, I think it was one of the churches from Nashville indicated they had 8 campuses, and half of those as a result of mergers. And we've asked this question in earlier surveys as well, and even at that point in time was about a third of campuses came as a result of mergers. This time we're getting a little bit slightly higher percentage at 40%. But then looking forward, this is where the numbers get really interesting to me. 44% see mergers as a viable path for the future of their strategy. 9% see it, an additional 9% see it as a central part of their strategy. And another 7% indicate they're exploring mergers, but they aren't quite sure how to start. So if you take all those together, just over 60% see mergers as a part of their future. In addition, 5% say while they've had mergers in the past, they will not consider adding campuses through this method in the future. And so I think that the future is bright in terms of mergers related to multi-site, addition to multi-site campuses. One of the churches we've worked with now for a number of years is Woodside Bible Church up in the Troy, Michigan area. I believe they're at about 15 campuses currently, and most of those campuses have come through mergers. And they're a great church to learn from as you think about the merger process. They've done a very unique model. It's not a cookie cutter model as some of the merger relationships have been established, but they've actually taken each campus, each merger, and really determine again, it goes back to this knowing your people, knowing your community, and designing the merger in such a way that that campus continues to and actually more effectively is able to meet the needs of their community. So mergers are going to continue to be an important part of the movement moving forward.
Yeah, that is definitely for sure. So the other thing that's happening on the next slide is you can see that microsites and sort of the institutional and rural sites are becoming more and more popular. And so my first question on this kind of information is, why would that be? And I think this one in particular has to do with the level of leadership available to us within churches. Clearly there's more, 5, 6, and 7 kind of level leaders than there are 8s, 9s, and 10s. And it's much easier to lead a smaller thing than it is a bigger thing. And so these microsites and institutional rural type models, we have so many more leaders that are ready to participate and lead effectively in kind of a smaller context, that my personal opinion is we're going to see an explosion in these 3 areas as multi-site continues to grow. And I think it's a super positive thing when you consider also that our population as a whole, at least in America, is getting older. We're going to find a lot of people, and already are finding a lot of people that have done well or extremely well in their careers, and they're ready to get busy about finishing well, and they can lead these sites, they can disciple people, and they can do a fantastic job representing the Lord in a context that is, let's say, small in nature. And so I was really enthused about these findings here.
Yeah, Chris, I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we talked about the diffusion of innovation curve. This is where some of the new innovation is happening. And so just in the space with microsites, we're beginning to see kind of a multi-site meets neighborhood kind of conversations happening in several churches, where they're actually developing campuses that are neighborhood centric, if you would. Another thing that we're seeing in that space is some churches that are doing what they're calling pop-up churches. And so it's an affordable situation. They're going into areas of their region or beyond where they think they might want to have a campus, and going into very temporary kind of quarters, maybe once a month for a 6-month lease in a facility. They go in on a Sunday evening using existing equipment that they have for a portable location, and basically do a test run and see, okay, how is this going to work here? Is this a place that's viable that might work for us to establish a campus? The whole institutional kind of site thing. Community Christian Church is partnering with Alpha. The Alpha program now has programs going in prisons all over the country, and Christian is working with Alpha to begin to establish campuses in correctional facilities across the country as well. And then the growth in rural campuses is continuing to grow as well. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is this kind of, the church is in Kansas, and they've developed a model that's called the church in a box, and they actually are taking all the elements that you need to launch a campus and encouraging people throughout Kansas to launch these campuses, whether it's in their business, in the boardroom, whether it's in a storefront, whatever. So in rural settings, we're having the ability to really extend the message as well.
So Greg, one more mention on this is that in these smaller type settings are often very, very attractive to people that are not to the traditional church model of facility and a place to go, and that is, they drive by 5 and 12 churches to get to it. And when you consider, I hate to bring up a negative here, but when you consider the safety and security concerns that many Americans are starting to have, I really think that a smaller, innovative, neighborhood and really focused type ministry are going to do extremely well. They're going to have fewer people, but you're going to have more of them. So it's a great evangelism model.
You bet. Some really exciting things happening in that space.
So guys, we have a couple of quick questions. Greg, the question been asked by multiple people. Could you just give a quick definition of microsite, and does it have a size parameter?
Yeah, so we're pretty early in our understanding of that. There's a couple of models that are emerging. There's a model that's really what I would actually call more of an outreach kind of model. It's going into a setting like a homeless shelter. There's a church in California that has a service where they actually have a pop-up church. They have a microsite that's under a bridge where there's a lot of homeless, and so they're actually taking in, and it's really more of an outreach evangelism than really beginning to establish a microsite campus. And then there are some of the other models are really related to very specific kinds of demographics. So you may have a microsite that meets in a coffee shop, and it's not intended to, at least initially, to grow to be this big campus, but it's really kind of focusing in and targeting on a certain kind of person that's going to be attracted, and that happens in a particular setting. And then, as I mentioned, some of the others that are really building their model around neighborhood kind of related things. So you may have an original campus that has sites, and then coming out of the sites would be microsites, and it would be a neighborhood kind of gathering. And the idea behind that, in many cases, is they're beginning to look to see, okay, it's kind of an expansion strategy. As we move into a neighborhood, do we begin to get some enough growth around that? We kind of reach a critical mass, and that may indeed then become another campus. So in some ways, it's a part of the growth strategy. In other ways, it's very intentionally intended to reach a specific demographic, or it may be intended just to provide a much smaller setting in the context of a larger multi-site church.
And Chris, I know that, thinking about multi-site, people have the question that they're asking a lot. Are these live teaching? Are they video teaching? What do you think is out there? And I know we'll talk about this a little bit, but not directly related to microsite. What have you seen in this?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes to both. And it really has to do with the leader and how they are equipped and talented. And so I can give you example after example, and I would fit into this, that there are people that can communicate from the stage much better than me. And so let's platform them, but I can develop team and structure and support. And so there's a bunch of leaders that are that way. There are other gifted leaders that can orate very well. They have communication skills, gifts, and abilities that are above others, but they might not be as well at some other aspects of ministry. So it's really a both and world, I believe. And we just utilize what is best for the circumstances that we find ourselves within. That's a quick answer. I don't know, you've got a lot of experience in that too. So
no, I think you're exactly right that when it comes to the idea of microsite, I think it really speaks to the fact that there's a good deal, going back to what we talked about earlier, simplicity, that it doesn't, it doesn't bear a lot of the marks of what would be more of a traditional multi-site campus. And so people are doing it in so many different ways. And Greg, you mentioned the phrase church in a box, and I believe pop-up church as well. Could you just quickly hit on those thoughts? What are people doing when it comes to church in a box or pop-up church?
Yeah, so the church in the box was the thing I referenced just a little bit ago that is happening at Crosspoint Church in Kansas. I mean, they literally have put together, I had them ship me one so I could see what it looked like. It's literally a case, and they're providing a Apple TV player and then just resources. So literally, if I wanted to launch a church, a campus in my living room, I have everything I need to do that. And they're just giving those away to people. And then as they continue to be in communication with them, if it seems that there's a place for additional growth there, then they begin to establish a partnership in that context. The pop-up church is really more of a strategy to explore. It's another strategy to explore where you might launch an additional physical campus, and literally going into an area for a short-term commitment, maybe 6 months, one Sunday a month, having worship services, using existing kind of resources in terms of equipment and that kind of thing, and just seeing what the response is and determining if that's a place to launch a physical campus.
And guys, I know we need to move on, but there's also been some great questions around church governance and multi-site, and what are the needed changes. And Chris, just give me one quick change to consider before we transition on in church governance related to beginning the multi-site journey.
Okay, do it before you change it. So don't change it and then try to do it. Do the multi-site and then change in order to adapt to what you find. Many churches that struggled early on thought they knew, and so they changed some things, and then, oh my gosh, it was very difficult. So do it first and then change accordingly. Yeah. In other words, be flexible might be 2 words to do it, but don't change it.
We didn't actually ask that question on this survey, but we did historically. The majority of multi-site churches have one governance structure that governs all of their campuses. I'm beginning to see, though, more anecdotally, still maintaining that overall structure, but then having local leadership teams that may provide some of the oversight for the day-to-day operations at a campus.
The main thing here, too, on that, Greg, just if we think family, if we raise teenagers, we squeeze them hard and try to pull and all that, they're like the fish that squeezes. Well, your multi-site the same way as a church magistrates, it's good decisions. Prone to give them more flexibility, freedom than less. So that's
good.
That's good. All right, Greg, why don't you lead us into our next findings?
Yes, this is another one of the ones that I found fascinating and really intrigued by. Churches are reporting significant growth in the use of online campuses. Just under half, at 47%, indicated that they were using they had an online campus. And this is up from, we did the last survey was 5 years ago. We did it in partnership with Generis then as well. And at that point in time, only 28% reported an online campus. And in fact, in that survey, 62% indicated that they did not plan to launch a campus. And so this is pretty significant growth. And I think it's probably just mirrors the fact that we're doing more and more online and more that's happening in the digital spaces. One of the churches that we worked very closely with is Crossroads Community Church in Cincinnati. And they are really ramping up what's happening in terms of online in their space. In addition to just having online campuses, they're beginning to experiment with how do we make our online campus be really very intentionally a on-ramp to what's happening at a physical campus. So if you were to log on to their online campus based on where you're located, the geocode of your URL, you're going to get a different experience than you might get if you were, the next neighborhood over. And so some really creative things are happening in this space as well. We actually have another report, some other additional research that we've done in terms of online campuses, and we're going to be releasing a report called Behind the Screens that we'll release later in October, early part of November. So we'll have some more data on this coming.
Yeah, fantastic on that. And I'm going to try to conserve a little bit of time here and get us back on track. But when you consider that multi-site and church planting are both expansion moves that a church can be involved in, it's easy to see that multi-site churches would be not only pro-church plant, but very actively involved in planting churches as well. Because it's not about creating a site or a new church. It's about how do we expand God's kingdom given the talents, gifts, and abilities of a leader or the calling of our church. And so this is another one of those both and examples of we can expand the kingdom in lots of different ways. Multi-site works and church planting works. So which is right for you? Well, you got to figure it out based on your own calling and the leaders that God has brought alongside you.
And as we move to the next slide, our experience is that many churches do both. And they make the decision on if it's going to be a plant or a campus, typically based on one of two things. One would be geographical. Some would say if it's outside a certain geographical boundary, then that becomes a plant. Others make it based on calling or people. So if somebody feels called to plant a church, they're not going to put them in a role as a campus pastor. They're going to help them plant a church. But many churches are doing both. This next slide indicates that diverse preaching and teaching models continue to be the norm. Early on, and ever since the beginning days, people say, well, what's the best model? And I always have to say, well, it depends, because it really depends on your context. There's always been, the current data indicates that there's an even split between video live teaching combination, and then live on all campuses. But the mix has continued to shift, as you see in the chart at the bottom of the page. The video has grown. The first year that we did a survey, a national survey, it was at 20% all video. It's grown to 33%. The other thing that you can see that I think is significant is the drop in live at all campuses, which has dropped from 46% when we did our first survey to 34% with the current data. This is likely driven, kind of goes back to my slide a couple of slides ago with reference to the increase in online. And so I think that's probably driving some of this as well. Okay, two more quickly here. One is most multi-site churches continue to be highly centralized. Just over 3/4 see their multi-site model as more centralized than decentralized. The thing that I think that's changing in this conversation is what that means. We had a group of churches that we took to Chick-fil-A just about a year ago, and when you drive up to Chick-fil-A, to their headquarters, their sign doesn't say headquarters, it says Chick-fil-A Central Support Center. And so while we were there, we began to learn a whole lot about how that works in their context. And what many of the churches realized while they were there was that their central support was really more about central control than central support. And if you look at the model of Chick-fil-A, they kind of turn it on its head. So everything that they do at Chick-fil-A is about making the store operator successful. And so the churches are beginning, some of these churches that were part of that experience are beginning to say, okay, what does that mean for us? What does that look like? How do we ensure the success of campus pastors? And so some new things are happening in that space. Also, campus pastor continues to be the favored term for campus leadership. And we're beginning to see lengthening tenures in the role as campus pastor as well. As you can see, 81% continue to use campus pastor. The second largest was 7%. One of the new roles, or new names we're beginning to hear for this role is community pastor. Again, going back to Crossroads Church up in Cincinnati, their they now call their campus pastors community pastors because they're responsible for shepherding and leading not only the people that are showing up at their physical campus, but the online campuses that would feed into their physical campuses as well. So beginning to see just a few kind of new names that are coming as a result for that role. Couple of questions here, Josh.
Really, one key one is just, is there any insight on the video live combination? Any ideas, or does that vary just by each church and how they choose to implement that?
Yeah, what I've noticed, Josh, is it's more personal preference. Like there's not data to support one over the other or vice versa that I've ever seen. But there are strong personal preferences within a ministry or within an individual. And so my advice as I'm consulting with multi-site churches are, if you have a very super strong preference, then go with that. Don't try to buck against something. If that's really where your preference is, then do that. It's like, if you like to go sneaking and that's where you enjoy life and kind of relax and get contented, well, then you don't need to become a scuba diver. Just do more snow skiing. It's good for you. You don't have to try to be something else. But if you're really neutral, then just use that both and kind of model that Greg talked about.
Yeah, I think it's very driven by the ministry philosophy of the church. And many would see, many have made a decision to do all live teaching because they feel like it's one of the primary ways of developing new leaders and developing teaching leaders. So I think that's a key reason that oftentimes people use live teaching. I think the other reality is the reason that people, it's challenging to find people who are incredibly effective leaders as well as incredibly effective communicators. And so churches, I think, are taking advantage of that by using really effective communicators in the video model. So those are some of the things that impact and shape those decisions.
That's great. Well, Chris, why don't you just lead us into our last few insights here?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So this next slide sort of makes sense to me, but also I think it's important to digest it a little bit and understand it. We know that as human beings, we're creatures of habit. So it does make sense that the percentage of total attendance at different sites would be somewhat static. And in this case, most of the sending sites are older and more mature. So of course they have more people. But when you look into the numbers and you see that people generally attend the same place over and over again, it's super important to build what many churches are going to, and that is build community. Because one of the things that's missing in our culture is identity. People in our culture are starving for identity. It's one of the reasons that advertising works. Well, when we can have a specific identity, then people tend to gravitate around that identity and community ensues from that. And nothing can stabilize your ministry better than building a solid core of community. And by that, I mean where people want to be there, they want to connect with other people that are there. They don't want to necessarily connect with everybody that's there. That's impossible. But they want to connect with, like-minded people that are there. And that is the start of community. So take advantage of the idea that people live habitually. That means if they come and they find value, they'll come over and over and over again.
This was a really interesting finding. Number 16, student ministry pendulum may be swinging back to a more centralized approach. In a 2014 study, we reported that 73% of the churches that participated said their youth ministry was decentralized and they had a unique student ministry at each one of their campuses. Might, share a common curriculum, share a common kind of ministry philosophy, but they were staffed either in staffing or in full volunteers, and that the student ministry was actually happening at the campus. This data said that it dropped to 41%. And some churches are beginning to look at a more centralized model, whether that's centralized around the original campus or beginning to see centralized models developing around, particularly if you're in a large city, developing around school districts. So you may have, if there are several campuses in one school district, then the student ministry may surface, may be shaped around all the high schools that are feeding into that one particular area. So beginning to see at least some new experimentation with reference to what's going on in student ministry.
Yeah, and then of course, there are a number of challenges that face us in ministry in general. And so Multisite has some of its own set of challenges. I don't want to go through all of these, but I want to pick out maybe two to just comment on quickly. One of them is on number 2, helping campuses grow in attendance. We have to understand that there's a difference between growth and expansion. Growth is one thing gets bigger, expansion is more things. And so when it comes to helping a campus grow in attendance, that leader has to know the anatomy of growth. And, if we look at the plant world, there has to be soil, there has to be seed, and there has to be nutrients. So metaphorically, where are you, what's the area that you're in? That's the soil that you've been planted, so to speak. And what's the seed? That's the talents, gifts, and abilities that you're bringing to bear in that geographic region. And then what are the nutrients that are there? Man, the spirit, prayer, and all of the soft, quote unquote, areas of ministry. And so there is a sequential anatomy towards growth, and making sure that campus pastor is aware of, well, what does it actually take to grow is a big deal. And if they're not, the campus isn't likely to grow. And then the second one, at least for me, is number 6, self-sustaining finances. If you have some sites that cannot operate in the black on the operations side of their ministry, then you're not going to be able to grow very far, because you have what in my world are boomerang kids. Kids go off to college, they don't get a job right away, they come back to the house. We don't want boomerang campuses. We want campuses to be able to be self-sustaining immediately. And that means that they're operationally, financially sound from the get-go. If you have that as kind of your starting point DNA, then what happens is it affects everything. It affects the type of leader that you'll platform. It affects their role and responsibility. And being able to do that well ensures that if God calls you to it, you can expand even further. We can't expand without capital. And so it's really important, I think, for your multi-site ministry, at least at its core strategy, to have self-sustaining sites. So those are 2 comments on my end. Greg, you might have a few.
Yeah, it's good. I think just in light of our timing, I think I'll move on and let Josh, if there are additional questions that have come in, I'd love to be able to respond to some of those.
Yeah, the biggest question, guys, that's come up is how to develop campus staff through this last section. I think any insights that you guys would have related to this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we get, the biggest question we get when we ask churches what their greatest challenge is around developing leaders, right? And so one of the things that we've done a lot of work with, and Brent Doffel on our team is really the one who's spearheaded this, but really helping churches to understand the importance of developing a culture of leadership, and then also it's the systems related to helping people to develop as leaders. Oftentimes our experience is that churches have one or the other. They may say, yeah, we're all about leaders, and they may tell great stories about leadership, but they really don't have a good system in place for people to be able to raise their hand to say, hey, I want to be involved in leadership, or a system in place where they're systematically looking for leaders and inviting them into a process of becoming a leader, or vice versa. They may have a great system in place, but the system is grown cold because it doesn't really, it doesn't match up with the reality. And so there may be a place for you to sign up and say, I'm going to be a leader, but at the end of the day, you're not really given the opportunity to truly lead. You may be given a job to do or a task to be completed, but not really an opportunity to truly lead. So I think that's one of the things that's really important, that both of those things are held in tension. I like to describe when the church is working in this space, it's like a little bit like a rock climber. And so, as you're moving up the face of a cliff, reaching for the next handhold or the next foothold, and that may be really focusing in on culture, and then the next one may be on systems. And so it's this dance that you're doing to continue to move forward. In terms of how some of the specific things we've heard in terms of how campus pastors are developed, one of the things I think is key is that there's a mentoring opportunity in place. Not every, depending on the size of your church and the number of campuses you have, obviously the senior leader can't have a one-on-one kind of relationship with every one of the campus pastors, but the campus pastors do need to be exposed to that senior level leadership and have opportunities to have that kind of coaching and mentorship that happens. I know, Josh, you guys do a great job of that at Faith Promise, so you may have some specific insights on some of the things that you guys do there at the church.
Yeah, I think for us, it's that we're really keying in on creating these associate campus pastor roles where campus pastors developed really in the culture of what you want campus pastors doing. And that, I think, is one of the real challenges of campus pastor development is lack of clarity. So campus pastors don't always know what they're supposed to be doing to be effective. And so that's become a huge focus for us, is just to make sure that we're giving them really those key things that they need to be successful as a campus pastor. So Greg, that really, we're getting close on our time, I know. Why don't you help close us out?
Sure, you bet. Well, we are thrilled that you took the time to be with us today. I'm going to let Chris Mavity share a little bit about some of the things that they have available through Generis that might be additional helpful resources for you. And then we'll come back, and I got a couple of things I'd like to share with you about Leadership Network as well. So Chris, go ahead and share a little bit about what you got going at Generis.
Sure, Greg. Well, at Generis, we just launched our effective ministry team. It's been kind of in hibernation for a good couple of years, a team of people that God's bringing together that are proficient in kind of all areas of ministry. And so you can go to effectiveministry.com and see what's available there. Certainly multi-site stuff is part of that, leadership development, family ministry, small groups, all that kind of thing. But effectiveministry.com would be where to find that information.
That's perfect. As a reminder, you're going to get a full copy of the report in an email that will come to you a little bit later, as well as a recording of this webinar. And Josh, one of the things we're doing that's exciting, as I've mentioned, I've referenced a couple of times over the course of our time together, is our accelerator program. And Josh is working on that. Josh, why don't you share a little bit about that and how our participants might get involved with that?
Yeah, we're building an exciting cohort. We really believe that Multisite's moving into a new season. I call it 2.0, where data is going to begin to drive location decisions, where leadership development, particularly campus pastor and staff development, is coming to a new place. And then, ultimately, we see support changing. Churches are really having to start figuring out how to be matrix organizations and do that well. And that's been something that only happened in businesses up to this point. So we just created this accelerator really to create incredible impact for churches. We finished a group back in May, have a new one starting up this November. And man, I would love just to connect you if you're looking to really enhance your multi-site strategy. We have an incredible process to help walk you through that.
Very good.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's been fun to have an opportunity to be with you, and thanks, Chris, for your investment in the development of this report and the work that Generis is doing. We just are thrilled to be a part of what's happening in the kingdom, and thrilled to be able to have opportunities to come alongside those of you who are participating today. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to serve you in any way that we possibly can. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll connect soon.
Thanks, guys.
Right.